Before the rise of humanity, before the Emperor's grand vision took form, the galaxy was already a vast and ancient theater of war, ambition, and tragedy. To understand the pre-human era is to delve into a time of forgotten empires, primordial forces, and the seething energies of the warp, a time when the stars themselves bore witness to civilizations far older than humankind could ever imagine. In the eons before humanity's rise, the galaxy was a cauldron of creation and destruction, of glory and ruin. Forgotten empires rose and fell, their stories etched into the stars and the memories of those few who still walk the void. By the time humanity took its first tentative steps, the galaxy was already ancient, a place of ruins and relics, haunted by the shadows of what came before. To understand humanity's place in the galaxy is to understand this ancient past. We are not the first, nor will we be the last, to shape the stars. The galaxy is a cycle of hubris and fall, of empire and annihilation. Humanity's story is but a chapter in a tale far older than any can comprehend, a tale written in the blood of titans and the whispers of the warp. The birth of the entities, later known as the star gods, occurred at the same time as the moment of creation itself, as they formed from the vast, insensate energies first unleashed by that churning mass of cataclysmic force. In that anarchic interweaving of matter and energy, the sea of stars began to swirl into existence, and for an eon, the universe was nothing more than hot hydrogen gas and light elemental dust ruled over by the gravitic force of billions of newborn suns. Long before the first planets had formed and cooled, the very first truly self-aware beings emerged into the universe, their thoughts encased within the lines of force produced by the plasma and electromagnetic flares of the stars themselves. In later times, these entities would become known as the Catan, but early in their existence they were nothing like the malevolent beings they would eventually become. They were little more than monstrous energy parasites that suckled upon the solar energies of the stars that had brought them into existence, shortening the lives of otherwise main-sequence stars by millions of standard years. In time, these star vampires learned to move along the lines of the universe's electromagnetic flux, leaving their birthplaces to drift through the cosmic ether to new stellar feeding grounds and begin their cycle of stellar destruction once more. Beings of pure energy, they paid no mind to the hunks of solid matter they passed in the vacuum of space. The blazing geothermal fires and weak geomagnetic fields of these nascent planets, insufficient to be worth feeding even their ravenous hunger. Just as the stars gave birth to their children, so the planets of the newborn Milky Way galaxy eventually gave birth to life forms composed of matter, which began the long evolutionary climb to self-awareness. The first intelligent beings of the galaxy known to have developed a civilization technologically advanced enough to cross the stars was a reptilian species of beings later called the Old Ones by the Eldari, who knew them best of all their creations. The Old Ones possessed a slow, cold-blooded but still deep wisdom, having long studied the stars and raised astronomy and physics to such a level that their science and technology appear now to humanity like an arcane art. Their understanding of the workings of the universe were such that they could manipulate alternate dimensions and undertake great works of psychic engineering. The Old Ones were potent psychers who routinely used the powers of the warp for a wide variety of technological applications. This included the construction of a system of instantaneous faster-than-light portals through warp space. These portals connected all of the Old Ones' colony worlds, allowing them to cross the vast gulfs of space with only a single step through the myriad warp gates they built to connect the worlds of the galaxy. This was a vast interdimensional network, much like the webway of today, which is its direct descendant, though on a much larger and more advanced scale. Through this network, the Old Ones spread their spawn to many places in the galaxy, but they also knew that all life was precious. Where they passed, they seeded new intelligent species and reshaped thousands of worlds to make them their own, according to their predetermined environmental and geographic criteria. It is believed by some in the Adeptus Mechanicus that even Terra felt the Old One's touch long before humanity's rise to self-awareness, though this notion is considered heretical at best by the ecclesiarchy, as the imperial creed teaches that mankind was made in the image of the god emperor before his spirit was incarnated in physical flesh millennia ago. The Old One's civilization reached its height in excess of 60 million standard years ago. The Old Ones were responsible for the creation or genetic advancement of most of the currently active intelligent species of the galaxy, including the Aldari, the Krork, the Orc's precursors, the Slan, and the Jokairo, though it is unknown if they played any direct role in the evolution of humanity. The humanoid species that would become the necrons began their existence under a fearsome scourging star in the far reaches of the galaxy known as the Halo Stars region, billions of standard years before humanity evolved on Terra. Assailed at every moment by solar winds and intense radiation storms, the flesh and blood species known as the necrontire became a morbid people whose precarious lifespans were riven by constant loss. What little information the Imperium of Man has recovered on the necrontire tells that their lives were short and uncertain, their bodies blighted and consumed at an early age by the terrible cancers and other illnesses linked to the high levels of ionizing radiation given off by their sun. Necrontier cities were built in anticipation of their inhabitants' early demise, as the living were only brief residents scratching their daily livelihoods in the shadow of the vast sepulchres and tombs of their ancestors. Likewise, their ruling dynasties were founded on the anticipation of an early death, and the living were thought of as no more than temporary residents hurrying through the more permanent and lasting structures raised to honor the dead. On the necrontire homeworld, the greatest monuments were always built for the dead, never the living. Driven by necessity, the necrontier escaped their crucible prison and struck out for the stars, hopeful of carving out an empire in which they could realize their species' freedom from the lethal energies of their birth star. Using stasis crypts and slow-moving antimatter-powered torch ships that were clad in the living metal known as necrodermis, to resist the millennia-long journeys through the void, the necrontire began to colonize distant worlds. Little by little, the necrontire dynasties spread ever further until much of the ancient galaxy answered to their rule. From the earliest days, the rulers of individual necrontier dynasties were themselves governed by the Triarch, a council composed of 3 Necron dynasty monarchs known as pharaons. The head of the Triarch was known as the Silent King, for he addressed his subjects only through the other 2 pharaons who ruled alongside him. Nominally a hereditary position, the uncertain lifespans of the necrontier ensured that the title of Silent King nonetheless passed from one royal dynasty to another many times. The final days of the Necrontier Empire occurred in the reign of Zarek, the last of the Silent Kings. Sometime during their slow interstellar expansion, the Necrontire encountered an ancient species far older than any other in existence in the known galaxy. These beings were the Old Ones, and they were absolute masters of forms of energy the Necrontire could not even conceive of, yet alone wield. The Old Ones had long ago conquered the secrets of immortality, yet they refused to share the gift of eternal life with the Necrontier, who yet bore the genetic curse of the bitter star they had been born under. The colonization of much of the galaxy by the reptilian mystics had been immeasurably swifter and more expansive than that of the Necrontire because of their warp gates and mastery of the immaterium. That, and the Old Ones' incredibly long, if not downright immortal lifespans, kindled a burning jealous rage in the Necrontire, which ate at their culture spiritually as much as physical cancers consumed their bodies. The Necrontire were astonished to learn that another intelligent species enjoyed such long lives while their own were cut so brutally short. But as time wore on, further strife came to the Necrontire. Each dynasty sought to claim its own destiny, and soon the great houses were engaged in all-out conflicts known as the Wars of Secession. Had circumstances remained as they were for but a generation more, it is possible that the Necrontier would have wiped themselves out, as so many species had before them and shall do in the future. As their territory grew ever wider and more diverse, the unity that had made them strong was eroded, and bitter wars were waged as entire realms fought to win independence. Ultimately, the Triarch realized that the only hope of unity for their people lay in conflict with an external enemy, but there were few who could prove a credible threat to the technologically advanced necrontyre. Only the Old Ones were a prospective foe, powerful enough to bind the feuding necrontyre dynasties to a common cause. Such a war was simplicity itself to justify, for the necrontyre had ever rankled at the Old Ones' refusal to share the secrets of eternal life. So it was that Zarach, the last of the Silent Kings, in a typically bitter act of jealousy and resentment for the necrontyre race, declared war on the Old Ones. At the same time, he offered amnesty to any secessionist necrontyre dynasties who willingly returned to the fold of the Triarch. Thus lured by the spoils of victory and the promise of immortality, the separatist necrontyre realms abandoned their wars of secession, and what was later known as the War in Heaven began. A conflict unlike any fought before erupted across the stars, yet while the Silent King and the Triarch had succeeded in uniting their hateful people, it was a war the necrontyre could not win, not on their own. The terrible wars between the Old Ones and the necrontyre that followed, known later in Aldari myth as the War in Heaven, would fill a library in their own right, but the necrontyre could never win. Their superior technology was consistently outmaneuvered by the Old Ones thanks to their mastery of the webway portals and warp gates. The necrontyre were pushed back until they were little more than an irritation to the Old Ones' dominance of the galaxy, a quiescent threat clinging to their irradiated world among the halo stars, exiled and forgotten. The necrontyre's fury was cooled by their long millennia of imprisonment on their homeworld, slowly transforming into an utter hatred towards all other forms of intelligent life and an implacable determination to avenge themselves upon their seemingly invincible enemies. But in the face of defeat, the always fragile unity of the necrontyre began to fracture once more. No longer did the prospect of a common enemy have any hold over the disparate dynasties. Scores of generations had now lived and died in the service of an unwinnable war, and many necrontyre dynasties would have gladly sued for peace with the Old Ones if the ruling Triarch had permitted it. Thus began the second iteration of the Wars of Secession, more widespread and ruinous than any that had come before. So fractured had the necrontyre dynasties become by then that had the Old Ones been so inclined, they could have wiped out their foes with ease. Faced with the total collapse of their rule, the Triarchs searched desperately for a means of restoring order. In this, their prayers were answered, though the price for their species would be incalculably high. It was during the reign of the Silent King Zarach that the godlike energy beings known as the Khitan first blighted the necrontyre. It is impossible to say for certain how the necrontyre first made contact with the Khitan, though many misleading, contradictory, and one-sided accounts of these events exist. The dusty archives of the tomb world of Solemnace claim it was but an accident, a chance discovery made by a stellar probe during the investigation of a dying star. The Book of Mournful Night, held under close guard in the Eldari Black Library's innermost sanctum, tells rather that the raw hatred that the necrontyre held as a species for the Old Ones sang out across space, acting as a beacon that the Khitan could not ignore. Another account claims that from the earliest days of their civilization, necrontyre scientists had been deeply engaged in stellar studies to try to understand and protect themselves from their own sun's baleful energies. After long, bitter centuries of searching for some power to unleash upon the Old Ones, the necrontyre researchers used stellar probes to discover unusual electrodynamic anomalies in the oldest dying stars of the galaxy. In the complex skeins of the energetic plasma of these suns, the necrontyre found an intelligence that was more ancient than that of any of the corporeal species in creation, including the Old Ones, entities of pure energy that had spawned during the birth of the stars eons before. These entities had little conception of what the rest of the universe entailed when the necrontyre first found them, feeding upon the solar flares and magnetic storms of these bloated red giants. Here was the weapon the necrontyre had long sought to bring about the downfall of the Old Ones, beings they believed were the progeny of the death god they had long worshipped. Howsoever first contact occurred, the shadow of the Catan fell over the oldest necrontyre dynasties first. The power of these star-born creatures was incredible. The raw energy of the stars made animate, and the necrontyre called them the Catan, or star gods, in their own tongue. The Catan were dispersed across areas larger than whole planets, their consciousnesses too vast for humanoids to comprehend. How the necrontyre ever managed to communicate with them is unknown to the Adeptus Mechanicus. Understanding that such diffuse minds could never perceive the material universe without manifesting themselves in a material form, some necrontyre actively sought the Catan's favor and oversaw the forging of physical shells for the Catan to occupy, cast from the living metal called necrodermis that they had once used for their colony torch ships. Fragmentary Aeldari legends tell of translucent streamers of electromagnetic force shifting across space as the star vampires coiled into their new bodies in the physical realm across an incorporeal bridge of starlight. Thus clad, the Catan took the physical shapes of the necrontyre's half-forgotten gods, hiding their own true desires beneath cloaks of obsequious subservience. Incomprehensible forces were compressed into the living metal of the necrodermis bodies which the necrontyre had forged as the full power of the Catan at last found form. As the Catan focused their consciousnesses and became ever more aware of their new mode of existence, they came to appreciate the pleasures available to beings of matter and the other realities of corporeal life. The deliciously focused trickles of electromagnetic energy given off by the physical bodies of the necrontyre all about them awakened a new hunger in the Catan, very unlike the one they had once sated, using the nourishing but essentially tasteless energies of the stars. So it was that one of the Catan came before the silent king Sarek, acting as forerunner to the coming of his brothers. Amongst his own kind, this Catan was known as Mephetran, the Deceiver, for he was willfully treacherous. Yet the Silent King did not know this Catan's true nature, and instead granted the creature an audience. The Deceiver spoke of a war, fought long before the birth of the necrontyre, between the Catan and the Old Ones. It was a war, he said, that the Catan had lost. In the aftermath, and fearing the vengeance of the Old Ones, he and his brothers had hidden themselves away, hoping one day to find allies with whom they could finally bring the Old Ones to account. In return for this aid, the Deceiver assured, he and his brothers would deliver everything that the necrontyre craved. Unity could be theirs once again, and the immortality that they had sought for so long would finally be within their grasp. No price would there be for these great gifts, the Deceiver insisted, for they were but boons to be bestowed upon valued allies. Thus did the Deceiver speak, and who can say how much of his tale was truth? It is doubtful whether even the Deceiver knew, for trickery had become so much a part of his existence that even the Catan could no longer divine its root. Yet his words held sway over Sarek, who, like his ancestors before him, despaired of the divisions that were once again tearing his people apart. For long solar months he debated the matter with the other two Pharaons of the Triarch and the nobles of his royal court. Through it all, the only dissenting voice was that of Oricon, the court astrologer of the Triarch, who foretold that the alliance between the necrontyre and the Catan would bring about a renaissance of glory, but destroy forever the soul of the necrontyre people. Yet desire and ambition swiftly overrode caution, and Oricon's prophecy was dismissed. A necrontyre year after the Deceiver had presented his proposition, the Triarch agreed to the alliance, and so forever doomed their species. For their part, the necrontyre soon fell into awe of their discoveries, and the Catan moved to take control over their benefactors. The powers of the Catan manifested in the physical world were indeed almost godlike, and it was not long before the Catan were being worshipped as the star gods the necrontyre had named them. Perhaps they had been tainted by the material universe they had become a part of, or perhaps this had always been their nature even when they were bound to the suns they fed upon. But the Catan proved to be as cruel and capricious as the stars from which they had been born. They soon reveled in the religious worship of the necrontyre and feasted upon the electromagnetic life energies of countless mortal slaves. Armed with weapons of godlike power and starships that could cross the galaxy in the blink of an eye through the use of quantum phase technology, the necrontyre stood ready to begin their war against the Old Ones anew. But the Catan had another gift for their mortal subjects. They offered the necrontyre a path to immortality and the physical stability their species had always craved. Their diseased flesh would be replaced with the living metal of necrodermis that made up their star god's own physical forms. Their discarded organic husks would be consumed, and their cold metal forms would then be free to pursue their great vengeance against the Old Ones and the rest of a hateful universe, freed forever from the weaknesses of their hated flesh. With the pact between necrontyre and Catan sealed, the star gods revealed the form that immortality would take for the necrontyre, and the great biotransference process began. Vast biofoundries were constructed, and into these the Silent King's peoples marched according to the terms of the pact he had made with the Catan. What blasphemous procedures the necrontyre were subjected to within the raging biofurnaces cannot be known, but certainly each was stripped of flesh and of soul, their body replaced by a shell of living metal necrodermis, much like the Catan themselves, animated by what remained of their guttering self. Above each furnace swooped and dove the ethereal true forms of the Catan as they glutted themselves on the spiritual and electromagnetic detritus of an entire species. It was only when the Silent King himself emerged from the biotransference process and looked upon what had become of his people that he saw the awful truth of the pact he had made. Though immortality and nigh godlike strength and vigor were his, it had come at the cost of his soul, the etheric remains of which had already been sucked down the gullet of a circling Catan. As Sarek watched the Catan feast on the life essence of his people, he realized the terrible depth of his mistake. In many ways, he felt better than he had in necrontyre decades, the countless aches and uncertainties of organic life now behind him. His new machine body was far mightier than the frail form he had tolerated for so long, and his thoughts were swifter and clearer than they had ever been. Yet there was a terrible emptiness gnawing at his mind, an inexpressible hollowness of spirit that defied rational explanation. In that moment, he knew with cold certainty that the price of physical immortality had been the loss of his soul. With great sorrow, the Silent King beheld the fate he had brought upon his people. The necrontyre were now but a memory, and the soulless, undying necrons had been reborn in their place. Yet if the price had been steep, biotransference had fulfilled all of the promises that the Catan had made. Even the lowliest of the necrontyre was now blessed with immortality. Age and hard ionizing radiation could little erode their new mechanical bodies, and only the most terrible of injuries could destroy them utterly. The biotransference process had embedded engrammatic command protocols in every necron mind, granting Sarek the unswerving loyalty of his subjects. At first, the Silent King embraced this unanimity, for it was a welcome reprieve from the chaos and fractiousness that had consumed the necrontyre empire in recent years. The entire species was now his to command, and so it fell upon the necrons to honor their side of their terrible bargain. However, as time wore on, Sarek grew weary of his burden, but dared not sever the command protocols, lest his subjects turn on him seeking vengeance for the terrible curse he had visited upon them. Biotransference had left behind only the ghostly echoes of the necrontyre's consciousnesses. Only a few of the most strong-willed necrontyre among the nobility and the military retained their intellect and self-awareness, and even they were but shadows of their former selves. They had been purged of so much of what had made them unique individuals. But unlike the Silent King, most of the necrons at first cared not at all for their loss. All that mattered to them was that they would live forever without disease or death as their star gods had promised. Renewed and empowered as never before by their devouring of the souls of an entire species, the C'tan were now unstoppable, and with the undying legions of the necrons marching in their wake, the Old Ones were doomed. Only one thing truly remained of the old Necrontire: their burning hatred for all the other living intelligent species of the universe. Legions of the undying living metal warriors set out into the galaxy in their tomb ships, and the stars burned in their wake. The Old One's mastery of the warp was now countered by the C'tan's supremacy over the physical universe, and the ancient enemies of the necrons suffered greatly in the interstellar slaughter that followed. With the C'tan and the necrons fighting as one, the Old Ones were now doomed to defeat. Glutted on the life force of the Necrontire, the empowered C'tan were able to unleash forces beyond comprehension. Planets were razed, suns extinguished, and whole star systems devoured by black holes called into being by the reality-warping powers of the star gods. Necron legions finally breached the webway and assailed the Old Ones in every corner of the galaxy. They brought under siege the fortresses of the Old Ones' many allies amongst the younger intelligent species of the galaxy, harvesting the life force of the defenders to feed their voracious C'tan masters. In the closing years of the War in Heaven, one of the primary factors that led to the Necrons' ascendancy was their ability to finally gain access to the Old One's webway. The C'tan known as Nyad-Razath, the Burning One, had long desired to carry his eldritch fires into that space beyond space, and so showed the Necrons how to breach its extra-dimensional boundaries. Through a series of living stone portals known as the Dolmen Gates, the Necrons were finally able to turn the Old One's greatest weapon against them, vastly accelerating the ultimate end of the War in Heaven. The portals offered by the Dolmen Gates are neither so stable nor so controllable as the naturally occurring entrances to the webway scattered across the galaxy. Indeed, in some curious fashion, the webway can detect when its environs have been breached by a Dolmen Gate, and its arcane mechanisms swiftly attempt to seal off the infected spur from the rest of the labyrinth dimension until the danger to its integrity has passed. Thus, Necrons entering the webway must reach their intended destination through its shifting extra-dimensional corridors quickly, lest the network itself bring about their destruction. Of course, in the present age, eons have passed since the Necrons used the Dolmen Gates to assault their arch-enemies. The Old Ones are gone, and the webway itself has become a tangled and broken labyrinth. Many Dolmen Gates were lost or abandoned during the time of the Necrons' Great Sleep, and many more were destroyed by the Eldari, the Old Ones' successors as the guardians of the webway. Those that remain grant access to but a small portion of the immense maze that is the webway, much of that voluntarily sealed off by the Eldari to prevent further contamination. Yet the webway is immeasurably vast, and even these sundered skeins allow the Necrons a mode of travel that far outpaces those of the younger races. It is well that this is so. As a species bereft of psychers as a result of the loss of their souls during the biotransference process, the Necrons are also incapable of warp travel, and without access to the webway, they would be forced to rely once more on slow-voyaging stasis ships, dooming them to interstellar isolation. In the wake of these victories, the C'tan and their undying Necron servants now dominated the galaxy. The last planetary bastions of the Old Ones were besieged, and the intelligent species they had once nurtured became cattle for the obscene hunger of the C'tan. To the younger intelligent species of the galaxy, the Necrons and their star gods were cruel masters, callously harvesting their populations at will to feed the C'tan's ceaseless hunger for life energies. The C'tan were figures of terror who demanded mortals' adoration and fear in equal measure. For unknown reasons, but probably because their individual hungers for mortal life energies knew no bounds, the C'tan ultimately began to fight amongst themselves for both sport and out of spite. Among the Eldari, an ancient myth holds that their laughing god tricked the C'tan, known as the Outsider, into turning on its brothers and beginning their long war for ascendancy. In the course of the C'tan's struggle against one another, whole planets were razed, stars were extinguished, and entire solar systems were devoured by unleashed black holes. New cities were built by the efforts of millions and then smashed down once more. As the red harvests of the C'tan and their necron servants grew thin, C'tan eventually devoured C'tan, until only a few were left in the universe and they competed amongst themselves for a long age. Eventually, even the old ones, who had once been defined by their patience and unstoppable will, became desperate in the face of the necron assault. They used their great scientific skills to genetically engineer intelligent beings with an even stronger psychic link to the warp, hoping to create servants with the capability of channeling psychic power to defend themselves. They nurtured many potential warrior species, among which are believed to be the earliest members of the Aldari species and many other xenos races, including the Rashan, the Knib, the Krork, and many others. Terran millennia passed as the Old One's creations and experiments finally bore fruit, even as the C'tan and their necron servants continued to extinguish life across the galaxy. The Old One's psychically empowered servant species spread across the galaxy, battling the advanced necron technology with the psychic power of their warp-spawned magic. Facing this new onslaught, the C'tan's empire was shattered, as the psychic forces of the Immaterium were anathema to soulless entities whose existence was wholly contained within purely physical patterns of electromagnetic force. For all the destruction they could unleash, they were unable to stop the Old Ones and the younger races' relentless advance across the stars. The remaining C'tan, unified by this great threat for the first time in millions of Terran years, sought a way to defeat the soul-fueled energies of the younger species. They initiated a great warding, a plan to forever defeat the psychic sorceries of the Old Ones by sealing off the material universe from the warp, a plan whose first fruits could once be found on the imperial fortress world of Cadia, in the form of the great pylons that littered the surface of that world in intricate networks and create the area of space-time stability near the Eye of Terror, known as the Cadian Gate. With their godlike powers, it was only a matter of time until the C'tan succeeded. But before their great work was complete, the seeds of destruction the Old Ones had planted millennia before brought about an unforeseen cataclysm. The growing pains and collective psychic flaws of the younger species threw the untapped psychically reactive energies of the Immaterium into disorder. War, pain, and destruction were mirrored in the bottomless depth of the sea of souls that was the warp. The maelstrom of souls unleashed into the Immaterium by the carnage of the war in heaven coalesced in the previously formless energies of the warp. Older entities that had existed within the Immaterium transformed into terrifying psychic predators, tearing at the souls of vulnerable psychers as their own environment was torn apart and reforged into the realm of chaos. The denizens of the warp, stirred into a frenzy by the conflict in the Materium, clustered voraciously at the cracks between the Immaterium and the material universe, seeking new ways to enter the physical realm. The Old Ones brought forth new genetically engineered warrior species to defend their last strongholds, including the technology-mimicking Jokaero and the formidable green-skinned Krork, who were the ancestors of the present-day orcs, but it was already too late. The Old One's intergalactic webway network was breached from the Immaterium and lost to them. Several of their warp gates were destroyed by their own hands to prevent the entities of the warp from spreading to uncorrupted worlds, and the Old One's greatest works and places of power were overrun by the horrors their own creations had unleashed. The most terrifying of these horrors were the enslavers, warp entities whose ability to dominate the minds of the younger species and create their own portals into the material realm using mutated, possessed psychers brought them forth in ever greater numbers. For the Old Ones, this was the final disaster as the enslavers took control of their servants. The Pandora's box unleashed by the creation of the younger species finally scattered the last of the old ones and broke their power over the galaxy once and for all. Life had stood at the edge of an apocalypse during the war in heaven between the old ones and the C'tan. Now, as the enslavers breached the immaterium in epidemic proportions, the survivors looked doomed. Ultimately, beset by the implacable onset of the C'tan and the calamitous warp-spawned perils they had themselves mistakenly unleashed, the old ones were defeated, scattered, and finally destroyed. Whether the species went extinct or simply fled the galaxy to seek a new haven elsewhere is unknown. Throughout the final stages of the war in heaven, Sarek bided his time, waiting for the moment in which the C'tan would prove most vulnerable. Though the entire necron species was now his to command, the Silent King could not hope to oppose the C'tan at the height of their power, and even if he did and met with success, the necrons would then have to finish the war in heaven against the old ones and their increasingly potent allied species alone. No, the old ones had to be completely and utterly defeated before the C'tan could be brought to account for the horror they had wrought among the Necrontire. And so, when the C'tan finally won their great war, their triumph was short-lived. With one hated enemy finally defeated and the other spent from hard-fought victory, the Silent King at last led the Necrons in revolt. In their arrogance, the C'tan did not realize their danger until it was too late. The Necrons focused the unimaginable energies of the living universe into weapons, god-killing hypercannons devised by the finest cryptex in the galaxy, too mighty for even the star gods to endure. Not even the great overlords of the Necron crown worlds well remember the battles against the star gods, for causality itself was damaged by the forces unleashed to dismember the C'tan, and the Silent King was wont to remove the knowledge of the dreadful weapons employed from his warriors after the fact in fear of what might later be done with them. Alas, the C'tan were immortal star spawn, part of the fundamental fabric of reality, and therefore nigh impossible to destroy. So was each C'tan instead sundered into thousands of smaller and less powerful energetic fragments, each with the personality of the whole entity, yet this outcome was sufficient to the Silent King's goals. Indeed, he had known the C'tan's ultimate destruction to be impossible and had drawn his plans accordingly. Each newborn C'tan shard was bound within a multi-dimensional tesseract labyrinth, as trammeled and secured as a legendary Terran djinn trapped in a bottle. Though the cost of victory was high, millions of Necrons had been destroyed as a consequence of their rebellion, including all of the members of the Triarch save the Silent King himself. The Necrons were once more in command of their own destiny. The Necrons had been vindicated in their pursuit only of science and control over the material realm, and certainly took pleasure in seeing the Old One's civilization collapse as a result of their overindulgence of psychic power and the end of the C'tan's domination over their species. Yet even with the defeat of the Old Ones and the C'tan alike, the Silent King saw that the time of the Necrons in the galaxy was over, for the moment at least. They would allow the enslavers to take what was left of the intelligent life in the galaxy and let it become an interstellar wasteland. The Psyker swarm would then die away, and in time the galaxy would evolve new life forms who would be less sophisticated and easier to dominate. In addition, the Necrons understood that the mantle of galactic dominion was soon to pass to the Aldari, one of the psychically potent species that had fought alongside the Old Ones throughout the war in heaven, and had thus come to hate the Necrons and all their works with the burning passion that is the defining characteristic of that species. The Aldari had survived where the Old Ones had not, and the Necrons, weakened by their expenditure of lives and resources in overthrowing the rule of the C'tan, could not stand against them. Yet the Silent King knew that the time of the Aldari would eventually pass, as it must pass for all those beings still cloaked in flesh. It would take millions of Terran years for the Aldari's power to fade, but what mattered is that the Necrons would be there to take advantage of it. So it was that the Silent King ordered the remaining Necron cities to be transformed into great tomb complexes threaded with stasis crypts. Let the Aldari shape the galaxy for a time. They were but ephemeral, whilst the necrons were undying and eternal. The Silent King's final command to his people was that they must sleep for the equivalent of 60 million standard years, but awake ready to rebuild all that they had lost, to restore the Necron dynasties to their former glory. This was the Silent King's final order, and as the last tomb world sealed its subterranean vaults, Sarek destroyed the engrammatic command protocols by which he had controlled his people for so long, for he had failed them utterly. Without a backward glance, Sarek, the last of the Silent Kings of the Triarch, took ship into the starless void of intergalactic space, there to find whatever measure of solace or penance he could. Meanwhile, eons passed and the Necrons slept on, their machine slaves and constructs guarding them while they slept on tomb worlds that had been purged of all life to keep the enslavers from their door. This plan worked with an amazing degree of success until the Necrons were awakened by the forces of the Imperium of Man in the 41st millennium to plague the galaxy once more. They discovered a new and unexpected age of interstellar civilization and war, much like the one they had left behind 60 million standard years before. The galaxy is blossoming with life once more, but is still overrun with latent psychers and worshippers of the infernal chaos warp energies first unleashed during the war in heaven. It will take time and a great many machinations for the Necron dynasties to regain their rightful place as the rulers of the galaxy. The agents of chaos must be overthrown, the dangerous Eldari, inheritors of the Old One's mantle, eliminated, humanity subjugated, and the great work cutting off the material universe from the warp completed before a new age of Necron dominion can truly begin. But the Necrons are ageless and undying, their technology still unmatched by any of the younger starfaring species. And time is always on their side. The galaxy's history is a vast and sprawling saga, marked by the rise and fall of empires, the ambitions of gods, and the relentless cycles of creation and destruction. In its most ancient and unrecorded epics, before the emergence of humanity, titanic forces shaped the fate of existence. The echoes of those times resonate still, reverberating through the stars, influencing the struggles of the 41st millennium and beyond. At the heart of these ancient tales were the Old Ones, the architects of life itself. Masters of the warp and reality's deepest mechanisms, their dominion over the galaxy was unparalleled. Yet their hubris became their undoing. By seeding the stars with sentient species and psychic power, they unknowingly set the stage for their destruction. In their arrogance, they believed themselves invincible, but they underestimated both the Necrontyre and the horrors of the immaterium that their experiments would unleash. The Necrontyr, born of suffering under the harsh radiation of their sun, sought not glory, but escape from death, disease, and the tyranny of time. Their transformation into the Necrons under the influence of the C'tan was a Faustian bargain, one that granted them the immortality they craved but stripped them of their souls. With their metallic forms, they became instruments of a war far greater than themselves, the war in heaven. This apocalyptic conflict saw the galaxy burn as the Necrons and their star godmasters challenged the Old Ones and their psychic creations. Yet the war was not a simple tale of conquest. The C'tan, once revered as gods by the Necrons, were eventually betrayed. The Necrons, led by the Silent King Sarek, turned on their creators, shattering the C'tan into shards and imprisoning them. This rebellion, however, came too late to save the Necrontyre's essence. They emerged victorious, but hollow, soulless beings bound to an eternal existence of metal and memory. The Old Ones, for their part, had sown the seeds of their own destruction. In their desperation to combat the Necrons, they created psychically potent species such as the Aldari and Krork, unleashing unprecedented energy into the warp. This tampering destabilized the immaterium, birthing chaos entities and horrors like the Enslavers, who ravaged the galaxy and overwhelmed even the Old Ones. In their final days, the Old Ones fell, their once great empire shattered and scattered, their legacy carried on by their surviving creations. As the dust settled on the war in heaven, the galaxy became a graveyard of shattered worlds, dormant empires, and fragmented gods. The necrons, weary of war and stripped of purpose, retreated into their tombs, entering stasis for millions of years. The C'tan, broken and imprisoned, became shadows of their former selves, their power diminished but their malice intact. The galaxy was left to the younger races, psychically potent but fragile, heirs to a cosmos scarred by the mistakes of their predecessors. For tens of millions of years, the galaxy lay in uneasy silence. The remnants of the Old One's works became myths, their webway labyrinth fractured and haunted. The necrons slept, their tomb worlds hidden beneath the sands of countless planets. The Eldari flourished for a time, building a glittering empire, only to succumb to their own excesses and birth the chaos god Slaanesh, perpetuating the cycle of hubris and ruin. Then, humanity arose. Compared to the ancient powers of the galaxy, humankind was young, fragile, and insignificant. Yet it was humanity's potential, its adaptability, and its capacity for unity under the Emperor of mankind that allowed it to carve its place among the stars. By the 41st millennium, humanity's Imperium stands as a bastion of resistance against the galaxy's myriad horrors, even as it teeters on the brink of collapse. The shadows of the pre-human era loom large over this grim future. The necrons, awakened from their slumber, now seek to reclaim their dominance, their dynasties vying for supremacy even as they battle the galaxy's younger species. The fragments of the C'tan, though diminished, remain potent forces of destruction, their influence seeping into the fabric of the materium. The Eldari, broken and scattered, struggle to preserve what remains of their once great civilization, their psychic gifts both a blessing and a curse. And then there is the warp, the immaterium, the ever-present reflection of the galaxy's collective soul. Its chaos gods, born of the emotional excesses of mortal species, wage an eternal war against reality itself. The galaxy's younger races, humanity chief among them, find themselves ensnared in the same cycle of ambition, war, and ruin that defined the pre-human era. The legacy of the war in heaven is a galaxy forever at war. It is a universe where ancient grudges and forgotten ambitions continue to shape the fate of countless worlds. The Necrons' dream of reclaiming their lost empire clashes with humanity's desperate struggle to survive, the Eldari's dwindling hope, and the Orcs' endless thirst for battle. All of this plays out against the backdrop of the Immaterium's ceaseless tumult, where the Chaos Gods revel in the suffering of the galaxy's inhabitants. Yet amidst this grim tapestry, one truth remains unshaken. The galaxy is ancient, its history written in the blood and sacrifice of countless civilizations. Humanity's rise is but a fleeting moment in the cosmic scale, a fragile flame in a storm of eternal conflict. To understand the present is to acknowledge the past, to see the scars left by the old ones, the Necrons and the C'tan, and to recognize that the cycle of hubris and fall is as inevitable as the stars themselves. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the echoes of eternity whisper of the past. They remind all who dare to listen that before humanity's rise, the galaxy was shaped by powers far greater, whose legacies continue to dictate its fate. And as the stars burn on, those echoes will remain, a haunting refrain of ambition, tragedy, and the inexorable march of time.